this presentation today as we sail past the lands where the gods and goddesses of ancient Egypt were worshipped. Probably not so many right around here because there wasn't a canal, and this would have been deep desert back 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years ago. But these are the lands of the pharaohs and the deities associated with the Egyptian religion. And this is, as any of you who came to my presentation yesterday were told by me then, a much more complex subject than you might think. Egyptian religion, ancient Egyptian religion, was very dynamic. It changed a lot over several millennia. So we're going to try to simplify it as much as possible for purposes of the time that we have. So it's still going to be fairly dense, and I'm going to walk that fine line between giving you a lot of information and not too much information. So we'll work through it. This one's just a little bit shorter than the one yesterday because the subject matter is a little less intuitive. It's a little more alien in a lot of ways than the Greek and Roman religion. So we'll do our structured presentation, and then to the extent that I can take questions at the end, I will. I suspect people will be eager to get out and see the canal, and I think something's coming on right afterwards. But any questions that I can't answer, I'll craft a question or an answer and put it up on one of my blogs, and I'll have all of that information at the end for you to check out. So our knowledge of Egyptian beliefs about their gods comes primarily from religious writings produced by priests and scribes, an elite that was distinct from the general populace, most of whom were illiterate in ancient Egypt. Existing Egyptian texts name an estimated 1,400 deities, many of them with scant description or unclear portfolios, just names, and numerous other unnamed gods are alluded to. Sorry, this is affecting my glasses. Hieroglyphic symbols used to represent deities in general included a flag flying from a pole, as we can see at the right side of our graphic in the hieroglyphics depicted here, a falcon, or a seated male or female deity. And goddesses might also be represented by an egg or a cobra. So if you're in Egypt, you're not going to be on the ground in Egypt on this trip if everything goes well. But next time you're in Egypt or in an Egyptian museum, those are the kinds of symbols you're going to look for. Those are going to be indicative of a deity. The flag, an egg or a cobra for a female, a seated deity, a falcon. Those are all indicative of the presence of a deity in a hieroglyphic message. Egypt's earliest known temples appeared toward the end of the 4th millennium BC, so somewhat more than 5,000 years ago. So that's really when we talk about ancient Egyptian religion, this is when that tradition begins. And that was during the last few centuries of what was known as the pre-dynastic era. And we're not going to get into all of these different dynasties. I think there were something like 30-some dynasties, and it really just gets overwhelming. I'll make reference to some of them just for placement purposes, but this is not an Egyptian history class, and we wouldn't have time to give it justice anyway. So the first written references to the gods of Egypt comes from the early dynastic period around 3100 to 2686 BC. Okay, so once again, about 5,000 years ago. And these entities must have emerged sometime in the preceding era and evolved from prehistoric religious beliefs. So the original Neolithic, late Stone Age agriculturalists of the Nile Valley started to develop a pantheon of deities. And as we'll see, they're based in many cases on ideas, on natural concepts. So the very first one might have been a deity of the Nile, a deity of the river. And these all evolved probably from about 12,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago, up to the point where they actually became what we could characterize as an ancient Egyptian religion. So there was a proto-religion that laid the basis for that. Egyptian religion as such coalesced with the unification of Egypt, in which rulers from Upper Egypt, made themselves pharaohs of the entire country. So when we talk about Upper Egypt, we're talking about from Nubia around the cataracts, so southern Egypt. We say upper, but it's southern Egypt to about the middle of the country. And then from the middle of the country to the coast through the delta, which we just sailed through, that would have been lower Egypt. So kings from Upper Egypt consolidated control over the entire country. These sacred kings and their subordinates assumed the exclusive right to interact with the gods. That's a good concession to have, good monopoly to have. And kingship became the unifying focus of the religion. As we know, when we think of Egyptian religion, we think of Egypt, we think of the pharaohs. New gods continued to emerge after this transformation. Some important deities, such as Isis and Amun, are not known to have appeared until the Old Kingdom during the middle 500 or so years of the 3rd millennium BC. So very dynamic. Places and concepts could suddenly inspire the creation of a god to represent them. This is how we get 1,400 known deities, an oasis or a mountain could inspire the creation of a deity. And deities were sometimes even created to serve as cross-sex counterparts of established divinities. So if we had a male divinity of a particular portfolio and there was no female, we could say, well, this deity needs a wife. And we could create a deity, conceive of a deity, and that was the whole idea behind Egyptian religion. If you could conceive of it, that was the first step in if you could conceive of it, then it probably existed. So I think it's sort of a type of epiphany or revelation in a sense. It's not so much making up your religion as you go along. It's sort of discovering your religion through epiphany and revelation. In addition to what we might normally think of as deities, as gods and goddesses, the pharaoh, the souls of deceased people, and sometimes even powerful officials like court architects could become objects of worship and be considered divine. It is unclear, however, whether most Egyptians actually believed to be the king to be a god, and he and other deified mortals may only have been considered divine when they were acting in a ceremonial capacity. So the pharaoh in movies like the Ten Commandments always very arrogantly makes himself out to be a god. Whether he really believed himself to be a god, whether anybody believed him to be a god, or whether they just believed him to be divinely touched when he was acting as the high priest of Egypt, that's not completely clear to us. And it might have actually varied from era to era. It might have been one way in one century and another way in another century. There was also belief in a great variety of supernatural beings that were not worshipped and which might more or less be said to correspond to entities like angels, demons, devils, jinn, the sorts of things that appear in other religious traditions. So the Egyptians believed in the same kinds of things. They just would have had other names for them, and they would have had a slightly different place in their cosmology. Such beings, these demons or devils or jinn or whatever, might act as servants or messengers of the gods, as guardians of specific places, objects, or activities, and variously be either hostile to people or watch over and advise them. Just like demons and devils and jinn in traditions that followed. Ancient Egyptian writings describe the gods' bodies as being made of precious materials. These are the descriptions that we're getting in these ancient writings. With flesh of gold, bones of silver, hair of lapis lazuli, and a smell like the incense used in rituals. Some texts even give precise descriptions of particular deities, including their heights and eye colors. And of course, this is something we don't have in our religious tradition. When you read the Bible, very rarely do you get a description as to someone's height or their eye color, their hair color. But this was something that was very much a part of the Egyptian canon. Ancient texts suggest, however, that the gods had true forms that were mysterious, So there was this acknowledgement that humans could conceive of what their forms were, but didn't necessarily know what they were. They could only try to put things in human terms. And there was this idea that the common descriptions of them were iconographic in nature and meant to emphasize divine characteristics rather than literally express that the deities were made of gold. You know, we say that the deity's skin is made of gold. We don't necessarily think it's the metal gold, because people knew that that was something that could be extracted from the ground and processed and forged. So we're talking about something that is evocative of gold. So, speaking to divine characteristics, a good example is the funerary god Anubis, who we can see here on the left. And his snout might be getting a little lost in the black background, but he does have a snout there. And he's commonly depicted as having the head of a jackal. And this is in an effort to magically counter the threat posed to mummies by the scavenging of such creatures. His black coloration furthermore alluded to the appearance of both mummified flesh and to the fertile black soil that Egyptians saw as a symbol of resurrection. So there's a lot of what we would call, I'm going to ask a funny question here. Has anyone ever here read a book written about 1920 called The Golden Bough? Has anyone read The Golden Bough? All right, well, this is a book on an early anthropological book that looks at magical and religious practices around the world. So what we're looking at is sympathetic magic here. We're looking at certain characteristics being incorporated into imagery for purposes of evoking certain effects. Most gods were depicted in several ways so as to emphasize different aspects of their natures. Remember we talked about the Greek gods yesterday. We talked about their epithets. So one statue of a Greek god, a statue of Zeus is generally going to look like a statue of Zeus, all right? So there's going to be very specific iconography associated with Zeus. But then he's going to have all of these other epithets, these nicknames. Zeus is going to be known as the All-Father and the Stormbringer. He's going to have all of these different epithets. Well, the way this was represented in a world, the world of ancient Egypt, where people weren't as literate, was by having just a separate image for every epithet. So every epithet of the deity would have a different image. And once again, this is probably how we're getting up to 1,400 deities. We might really only be looking at 1,000 or 500 different deities and really just looking at specific aspects or epithets of them. So, fertility goddess Hathor, for example, who we can see here in the middle, could be shown as a cow, a cobra, a lioness, or a woman with bovine horns or ears. Combinations of forms, such as gods with human bodies and animal heads, were common, as we all know, and new forms and increasingly complex combinations arose throughout the history of Egypt. Iconography presented in these depictions was, in fact, complex and overlapping enough that some gods could only be distinguished from one another if they were labeled. So they ran out of symbols after a point, and we could only tell the difference between this god who has these characteristics and this god who has exactly the same characteristics if they had a hieroglyph to differentiate them. And this was the case with the goddesses Isis and Hathor. They could be represented identically, and we wouldn't know if we were looking at Isis or Hathor. If we're looking at the Greek goddess Hera or the Greek goddess Aphrodite, we're always going to be able to tell the difference between them, because Hera is going to have a crown, Aphrodite never wears a crown. There are going to be differences between them. But with the Egyptian deities, it's really a much muddier picture. Certain features of divine images are more useful than others in determining a god's identity, and the head was particularly significant. So go to the head first if you're looking at imagery in a museum or an exhibit. Headdresses, which range from the same types of crowns used by human kings to large hieroglyphs, are another important indicator. So a hieroglyph above the head, not literally worn, but metaphorically worn. In contrast, objects held in God's hands tend to be generic, with male deities holding staffs. If it's holding a staff, that doesn't point to the deity, just indicates it's male. Goddesses holding stalks of papyrus, and both sexes carrying ankhs, so the cross with the ring at the end. Likewise, clothes worn by anthropomorphic deities, human-formed deities, in all periods changed little from the earliest times. A kilt, false beard, and often a shirt for male gods and a long, tight-fitting dress for goddesses, as we can see with the goddess in the middle. Child gods were shown nude. So that's not a prurient thing. That's just a tell. That's how we identify that we're looking at a child. As were some adult gods when their procreative powers were emphasized, and certain male deities were given heavy bellies and breasts. You can see this in some cases, signifying either androgyny or prosperity and abundance. So there is some, when I said that the pantheon is more alien to us than the Greek pantheon, it really is less intuitive to us as modern people. There are a lot of things we wouldn't necessarily pick up on intuitively. And whereas most male gods had red skin and most goddesses were yellow, that's a good way to tell. We see here, Anubis has reddish skin, or Hathor, or whoever she is, has the yellow skin. Sometimes they had completely different colors, symbolic colors. So a few deities, such as Osiris, for example, had green skin, as we see over here. He also had a mummiform appearance with his limbs pulled tightly around him, as if he were a mummy. And forms in which the gods are shown, while diverse, so we've already established there's a lot of different ways they can be represented, they're nonetheless limited. They're finite. Animals that were absent from Egypt early in its history, for example, such as the horse, were never used in divine images. So fairly early on in the history of Egypt, the horse was introduced and used for pulling chariots early on, and then, 500 years after that as a mounted animal. But horses never appear in the iconography. So there was a certain canon of what could be used, established early on, and things like horses were not included. Most Egyptian deities represented natural or social phenomena, including everything from abstract concepts to physical places and objects. Shu, for example, was the deification of air. The goddess Meretseger oversaw the necropolis at Thebes. So pretty narrow portfolio. There is a complex of tombs, and this is what she's the deity of. And the god Sia personified the idea of perception. So something very, very philosophical there. Major gods often had many roles and were involved with several types of phenomena. Khnum, for example, was the god of Elephantine Island in the Nile, and we'll have a picture of that toward the end of the presentation. And Khnum was sometimes credited with producing the annual flood that fertilized the nation's farmland. So probably a very early deity, because that was one of the first phenomena people would have taken advantage of. And perhaps as an outgrowth of this function in some areas, Khnum was said to create all living things, fashioning their bodies on a potter's wheel. And we'll see as we move ahead, the creator deity kept changing throughout Egyptian history. And then finally, roles of each deity were very fluid, and a god could expand its nature to take on new characteristics, and as a result, their portfolios are often difficult to neatly categorize or define. We're looking back over thousands of years of Egyptian history, but from their point of view, they only knew what a deity was credited with doing at any given time. Even looking into the past, people might not necessarily realize what a deity did 200 or 500 years before, and they certainly didn't know what they were going to do a couple hundred years in the future. So we have a perspective that these people did not have. Their flexibility notwithstanding, the gods were not generally considered to be either omnipotent or omniscient. So in modern religion, in Christianity, in Islam, we conceive of Judaism, we conceive of God as being omniscient and omnipotent, sometimes even omnipresent. And that was not what the Egyptians believed of their gods. And the gods had limits on what they could accomplish. And they had to struggle like everyone else, and we'll look at some of that. So despite their diverse functions, most gods had a primary common role. The gods had very broad portfolios, but most of them had a primary thing they were supposed to do, and that was maintaining Maat, M-A-A-T, the universal order that was a central principle of Egyptian religion. And they did so using a fundamental power called Heka, a term that's usually translated as magic, but it's their divine power. So most gods, regardless of their specific things that they could do, maintaining order throughout the land of Egypt, throughout society, that was the main thing that most of them were supposed to do. Some deities represented the disruption of Ma'at. Foremost among them, Apep, a chaos serpent that continuously threatened to annihilate the order of the universe, and Set, who could oppose disorder, but often fomented it instead. And this Apep, this chaos serpent, we're seeing the same figure invented again and again. We have the chaos serpent of the Norse that Thor ends up fighting in the final battle in the Ragnarok. And the characteristics of these chaos serpents, the one in Scandinavia and the one in Egypt, they're almost identical. They're the same chaos serpent. It's the same concept. And it isn't even really interpreted in different ways. It's just the same concept interpreted the same way by different peoples. So this is something that people responded to. It gets represented in the same kind of way in the Bible in the Garden of Eden. The serpent's smaller and he's peddling fruit, but it's the same idea. So that is, if you could have a Satan figure in this pantheon, it's going to be Apep. Not Set. Set's a problematic character, but he's not the devil. Egyptian mythology mainly concerned the gods' actions during a vague past in which they were present on Earth and interacted directly with humanity. So what we would have called the mythic era in ancient Greece. When Hercules actually walked the land, it's the equivalent era in Egypt. Events of this past time set the pattern for the events of the present of the ancient Egyptians. So their present time, their contemporary time, was all established during this mythic era. Periodic occurrences were also tied to ones in the mythic past. A succession of each new pharaoh, for example, reenacted Horus's accession to the throne of his father Osiris. So everything that happened on Earth was seen as a model of something that had happened in the mythic era. And in such myths, the gods behave much like humans, feeling emotion, eating, drinking, fighting, mourning, becoming ill, even dying, and some have unique character traits. Set, for example, is aggressive and impulsive. So this is actually personality traits. While Thoth, patron of writing and knowledge, is prone to long-winded speeches. And what we're looking at here is a personification of Ma'at. So Ma'at is this idea of order throughout the land, and this is the goddess Ma'at. That was her name. The goddess of Ma'at is named Ma'at. Naturally, the first divine act was the creation of the cosmos, as we have in all religions, or almost all religions, described in several myths focusing on different gods. 8 gods who represent the chaos that precedes creation give birth to the sun god, who establishes order in the newly formed world. Ptah, who embodies thought and creativity, gives form to all things by envisioning and naming them. Atum produces all things as emanations of himself, and Amun, according to the myths promoted by his priesthood, preceded and created the other creator gods. And you can find parallels between this and Genesis. It's very easy. Everything always starts off as chaos. Everything is void, and then out of this void comes creation. So we're looking at really the same thing in Judaism as in ancient Egyptian religion, as in Babylonian religion. Of course, they're all in the same region, so it's not surprising that they all would have been incubated in the same cauldron. In most of these myths, in the period after creation, a series of gods rule as kings. A recurring theme in these myths is the efforts of the gods to combat the forces of disorder, of chaos, and Ra and the serpent Apep, battling each other each night, continue the struggle into the present time of the ancient Egyptians. So the ancient Egyptians believed that Ra and Apep, whether literally or metaphorically, battled each other into their present time, that was an ongoing battle that was never resolved. Another mythic theme is the death and revival of the gods. Once again, a theme that gets carried on into modern religion. And the clearest example of which a god dies is the story of Osiris's murder. The gods could murder each other, they could kill each other, and Osiris's subsequent resurrection as ruler of the underworld. So he was the green one that we saw before. The sun god was also said to grow old during his daily journey across the sky, to sink into the underworld at night, and to emerge as a young child at dawn. So every day he grew old and then was resurrected. So instead of being changelessly immortal, as in many traditions, the gods periodically died and were reborn by repeating the events of creation, thereby renewing the world. And ultimately, in these myths, the gods withdraw from the human world and install the pharaohs to rule Egypt in their place. So we go beyond our mythic era and into sort of a current post-mythic era. Gods were linked with specific regions of the universe. In ancient Egyptian tradition, the world included the earth, the sky, and the underworld. It's easy to conceive of. And surrounding these was the dark formlessness that existed before creation. So the world, including the earth, the sky, and the underworld, was like a bubble floating in this vast sea of chaos. Chaos wasn't dispelled. It didn't end. The world was created, and it sort of stretches on infinitely out in every direction. So very much like modern people, most modern people, conceive of the universe. We have this little bubble where we all live, and then you get beyond it, and if there's anything else, we don't know for sure exactly what its characteristics are or what it is. So this I think is certainly astute. They weren't thinking literally like we were, but they had this concept that their world was surrounded by an unformed chaos. During the mythic age that we referred to, deities in general were believed to dwell in the sky, although those whose roles were linked with other parts of the universe were presumed to live in those places instead. Most mythological events took place in an earthly setting, and the gods there sometimes interacted with those in the sky. So we have stories where they're interacting with each other. The underworld, in contrast, was treated as a remote and inaccessible place. It always is, right? It was always remote and inaccessible to the Greeks. It's remote and inaccessible to us. It's something that's further away. And the gods who dwelled there had difficulty communicating with those in the world of the living. So a different character. The space outside the cosmos was also said to be very distant, but it too was inhabited by gods, some hostile and some beneficial to the earthly deities in the material world. So in the time after the mythic age, most gods were said to be either in the sky or invisibly present within the world, and temples were their main venues of contact with humanity. Each day the gods in the sky traveled to the earth, and there, in temples, they inhabited the statues that depicted them and allowed humans to interact with them in rituals. So that was the idea. Sometimes we'll hear references to the various pagan religions worshiping stone or worshiping gold or worshiping idols. They weren't worshiping these things. The Egyptians weren't in any event. They were creating the most precious idols that they could to honor their deities, much in the way that people create great churches or great mosques today. You're doing that to honor God. You don't think that God is the church. You don't think that God is the mosque or whatever. You know very well that this is a place that you're trying to invite God into. And it was the same way with the ancient Egyptian statuary. They built these lavish statues with the idea that the god would then come down and reside for a time in the statue. And when the god was residing in the statue, that would give them the opportunity to do their petitions or their prayers or their honors or whatever to the deity. So they worshiped the spirit of the deity that was resided in the statue for a short time. Deity spheres of influence on earth centered on the towns and regions they presided over, and the god of a city's main temple was the patron deity for that community and the surrounding region. So that's very much like what we see with the Greeks. Egyptian deities were connected to one another in a complex and shifting array of relationships, and their connections and interactions with each other helped define their respective characters. Family relationships were a common type of connection between gods. Deities were often linked in male and female pairs, reflecting the importance of procreation in Egyptian religious thought. Families of 3 deities, with a father, mother, and child, represented the creation of new life and the succession of the father by the child, a pattern that connected divine families with royal succession. Osiris, Isis, and Horus formed the quintessential family of this type. So once again, this speaks to iconography. When you're visiting an exhibit and you see one deity, a specific message is being sent. You see 2 deities, another message has been sent. 3 or 4, yet another message. So these different multiples of deities are the first step in interpreting what is being said in any given artistic representation. Genealogical connections like these were changeable. You know, we don't think of them as being changeable in the real world, but they were changeable for the gods, in keeping with the multiple perspectives in Egyptian belief. As a fertility goddess, for example, Hathor could act as a mother to any child god. So if Hathor was present and a child god was there, Hathor was the mother to that god. So it was very, very dynamic in that respect. You might notice that the style of art that we're looking at here is very different from everything we've been looking at up to this point. And that's not an accident. And if it isn't clear why, in a couple paragraphs from now, I'll explain to you. But this is actually a fresco from Pompeii. So this is a Roman fresco from Pompeii. So probably, about 2,000 years ago. Other divine groups were composed of deities with interrelated roles or who together represented part of the Egyptian mythological cosmos. There were also sets of gods for things like the hours of the day and night and for each province of Egypt. Once again, this is how we're getting to 1,400 known deities. Paired gods could also stand for opposite but interrelated concepts that were part of a greater unity, such as Ra, who was dynamic and light-producing, and Osiris, who is static and shrouded in darkness, but who merged into a single god each night. So 2 gods could become 1 god, and then it means something completely different. This divine assemblage had a vague and changeable hierarchy. Gods with broad influence in the cosmos, or who were older than others, had higher positions in divine society. At the apex of this society was the king of the gods, who was usually identified with the creator deity, a role that changed throughout Egyptian history. Horus was the most important god in the early dynastic period, for example. Ra rose to preeminence in the Old Kingdom, moving forward. Amun was supreme in the New Kingdom, and Isis was the divine queen and creator goddess during the Ptolemaic and Roman periods. So Isis became under Ptolemaic, which is essentially Macedonian or Greek rule. That was a Greek dynasty that ruled over Egypt after Alexander the Great. Ptolemy was one of Alexander's generals, and after Alexander died, there was a war of succession, and his generals broke up his empire. So Ptolemy took control of Egypt, so Egypt became a Greek-run state for a while. And then the Romans conquered Egypt, and it became a Roman province, a Roman state. And at that point, the Romans started absorbing Egyptian deities. So Isis became the most, seated here with the snake, became the most important deity, the preeminent deity in the Egyptian pantheon at that point. And she also became a very important deity to the Romans, who co-opted her. So Isis was worshipped in Rome during this period. Ancient Egyptians believed that gods and other supernatural beings were present throughout the world and capable of influencing both natural events and the course of human lives. Ibis-headed Thoth, for example, was the overseer of time and said to allot fixed lifespans to both humans and gods. And he is there toward the right, next to the hell beast there. Everyone from peasants to kings interacted with the gods, everywhere from humble country shrines to sprawling temple complexes, and for everything from personal reasons to the welfare of the nation. Ancient Egyptians' relationships with their gods were a fundamental part of their society, and they prayed for divine aid, called upon their deities for advice, and employed rituals to convince or compel them to act in desirable ways. Several texts also refer to gods influencing or inspiring human decisions, working through a person's heart, the seat of emotion and intellect in Egyptian belief. And what we're seeing here, and I'm sure there are several of you who recognize this, we're seeing a person going into the afterlife life being judged. And that is, in fact, the person's heart being weighed against their deeds. So a person would have their heart weighed, and if they were found worthy, they'd be able to go into some portion of the afterlife that wasn't that bad and was commensurate with their station in life. They're not going to transcend their station in life too much. And if their heart is impure and it doesn't weigh up properly, they're given to that horrible monster at the right, which has crocodile and lion and hippopotamus parts. It devours their soul, and then their soul just exists out in the outer darkness for eternity. So that's what we're looking at here. This is the equivalent of somebody coming before St. Peter, just scarier. Several texts, deities were also believed to give commands, instructing the king and the governance of his realm and regulating the management of temples. So God could speak to your heart and try to guide you to do the right thing, or God could speak to you in a dream, or, I don't know, vocally through a statue maybe, whatever. There were any number of ways that a god could speak to a person and command them to do something. Morality in ancient Egypt was largely based on the concept of Ma'at, which, when applied to human society, meant that everyone should live in an orderly way. And this is indicative of a place that had predictable floods, and where the fact that it could flourish as a nation was based on order and predictability. So humans should live in an orderly way that did not interfere with the well-being of other people. So there's sort of a natural morality there. Humans had free will to ignore divine guidance. So the Egyptians believed in free will and the behavior required by Ma'at, of course. But by doing this, they could bring divine punishment upon themselves and even their communities. So you could do things to harm your community if you didn't live according to Ma'at. There have also been suggestions that at various points the ancient Egyptians came to recognize a single divine power and to have, for at least a short period in the 14th century BC, when official religion focused exclusively on the sun god Aten, been ruled by a monotheistic pharaoh. So that is something that over the last 30 years I've heard thrown out as a theory. But what's more likely is that what is now referred to as Atenism simply placed this god above all the others. We know there was always a god at the top of the food chain in ancient Egypt. So probably there wasn't a belief that no other gods existed. There was simply an assertion that this was the most important one. And this, of course, is what we see in the Old Testament. You read the Old Testament, there are references to many, many, many gods. But the subjects of the Bible, the Israelites, are told, don't stray and worship these other gods. Be true to your own God. And that's the kind of concept we're looking at with Atenism. Not that all the other gods disappeared or that they never existed, but rather that this is now the preeminent and most important God, and the others all become secondary or tertiary or unimportant. Beliefs and rituals surrounding their gods formed the basis for the religion practiced by ancient Egyptians, which had emerged sometime prior to the founding of the Egyptian state around 3100 BC. So once again, back 5,000 years ago. Because these deities represented various natural forces, their worshippers appeased and bolstered them with offerings and rituals so that these phenomena would continue to function properly. You see the same thing for any of you who have ever visited any of the Mayan or Aztec pyramids. The sacrifices there were meant to perpetuate natural cycles. Authority to perform such devotions was controlled by the pharaoh, who was regarded as the god's representative and a link between the divine and human realms, responsible for managing the temples where they were carried out. Official religious practices, which maintained Ma'at, or order, for the benefit of all Egypt, were related to but distinct from the devotions of ordinary people who sought the god's help for personal problems. So when the pharaoh or the high priest for a province does a ceremony, that person is doing it for the good of the province or the good of all Egypt, the good of all Egyptians. But when you went to your own altar in your home or your village to pray, you're not trying to save Egypt, you're praying on your own behalf. So we really had worship operating on a couple of different levels. Official religion involved a variety of temple-based rituals. Some rituals were performed every day, whereas others were performed during festivals, taking place at longer intervals and often limited to a particular temple or deity. Worshippers made offerings to the gods in daily ceremonies in which they clothed, anointed, and presented food to their idols to encourage the deity to inhabit them, and recited hymns in their honor. These offerings, in addition to maintaining Ma'at for the gods, celebrated deities' life-giving generosity and encouraged them to remain benevolent. So you could tick off the gods. You wanted to, they had personalities. They were like people. You had to stay on good terms with them. Rituals for a god were often represented episodes from the mythic past, renewing the beneficial effects of the original events. In a festival to honor Osiris, for example, his death and resurrection were ritually reenacted at a time when crops were beginning to sprout and the returning greenery symbolized the renewal of the god's own life. So we're seeing a lot of parallels between Osiris and the Persephone, who was taken away to the underworld that we talked about yesterday in our talk in Greek and Roman religion. Festivals often involve ceremonial processions in which a cult image was carried out of the temple in a bark-shaped shrine, a boat-shaped shrine, which makes sense in a society that's riverine. And these served various purposes. In Roman times, for example, processions in many communities carried temple images to the riverbanks so that the gods could invoke a large and fruitful flood. Processions also traveled between temples, as when the image of Hathor from the temple at Dendera was taken to visit that of her consort, Horus, at the temple of Edfu. So these deities were periodically brought together so they could spend time together, at least symbolically. One would think if they were living in the sky, they could spend as much time there as they wanted to, but this was for the benefit of the worshipers. And we mentioned... was that Elephantine Island? No, that's Philae, I think. Okay. Under the Greek Ptolemaic dynasty and then Roman rule, Greeks and Romans introduced their own deities to Egypt. So we have a cross-fertilization. These newcomers equated the Egyptian gods with their own, in keeping with standard Greco-Roman practice, but worship of the native gods was not swallowed up by that of foreign ones, and rather Greek and Roman deities were adopted as manifestations of Egyptian ones. And Egyptian cults in this era sometimes incorporated Greek language, philosophy, iconography, and even temple architecture. So this was a very dynamic thing. Egyptian religion, if anything, was perhaps more dynamic over the millennia than either Greek or Roman. Meanwhile, the cults of several Egyptian deities, particularly Isis, Osiris, Anubis, the form of Horus named Harpocrates, and the fused Greco-Roman god or Greco-Egyptian god Serapis, were adopted into Roman religion and spread across the Roman Empire. Roman emperors, like the Ptolemaic kings before them, invoked Isis and Serapis to endorse their authority both within and beyond Egypt. Temples and cults in Egypt itself declined. Somebody asked a good question yesterday about when Greek religion ended, and it was sort of vague. It's a little more definite in Egypt. Temples and cults in Egypt itself declined as the Roman economy deteriorated in the 3rd century AD. And beginning in the 4th century, Christians suppressed the veneration of Egyptian deities, and the last formal cults at this temple in Philae died out by the 6th century. Okay, so by the 6th century AD, about 1,400 years ago. Up until that point, up until about 1,400 years ago, there were still vestiges of the indigenous Egyptian religion. Most beliefs surrounding the gods themselves disappeared within a few hundred years, remaining in sacred texts until the 7th and 8th centuries, and those are really the last references we have, maybe 1,300 years ago, to actual worship or belief in the Egyptian deities. All right. So that was an overview of Egyptian religion as viewed through their gods and goddesses. I hope it was instructive and enjoyable. I'll take however many questions we can manage, and any that I'm not able to answer right here, I'll address on one of my blogs.